I'm Danny Costa, 28, and I should be dead at least, according to my mother. For 8 months, she told everyone I died in a roadside bombing in Afghanistan, complete with fake military death notifications and a GoFundMe page that raised over $40,000 for my funeral expenses and her grief counseling. The betrayal cut deeper than any wound I'd ever received in combat, but what she didn't know was that I'd been discharged early due to injury, and had been quietly recovering at a veterans rehabilitation center, planning to surprise the family for my little sister's birthday. Instead, I walked into the community center to find my own memorial service in progress, complete with my photo surrounded by flowers, and my sobbing relatives sharing memories of my heroic sacrifice. The look on my mother's face when she saw me standing in that doorway of breathing and absolutely furious was worth everything that came next. If you've ever felt betrayed by the people who should love you most, you'll understand why. I had to expose the truth. The silence that followed my entrance into that community center was deafening. I stood there in my civilian clothes, duffel bag still slung over my shoulder from the long bus ride home, staring at my own enlarged photograph, propped on an easel surrounded by white lilies and carnations. My military portrait, the one I'd sent home after basic training, smiled back at me from beyond the grave. The first person to see me was Mrs. Rodriguez from next door. She'd been holding a tissue to her eyes, mid-sob, when she glanced toward the entrance. The tissue fell from her hand as her mouth opened in a perfect O of shock. Then came the screams. "Oh my God, oh my God." She stumbled backward into her husband, pointing at me like I was some kind of apparition. "It's Danny. It's him." The ripple effect was immediate and chaotic. Heads turned, chairs scraped against the floor, and someone's coffee cup shattered on the linoleum. My Uncle Frank, my mother's brother, went white as a sheet and reached for the wall to steady himself. Cousin Maria started hyperventilating, but it was my mother's reaction that I'll never forget. Linda Costa, dressed in a black dress that looked suspiciously new, had been accepting condolences near the memorial display. She'd been the picture of grief-red-rimmed eyes, trembling hands, the whole performance. When she saw me, every drop of color drained from her face. For a split second, I saw something flicker across her features that wasn't grief or shock. It was terror. "Danny," she whispered, and I heard her voice crack across the now silent room. "Baby, is that really you?" I walked deeper into the room, my boots echoing against the floor. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, everyone staring at me as if I might disappear at any moment. I stopped in front of the memorial display and picked up a printed program. "In loving memory of Danny Costa," it read, "beloved son, brother, and American hero, 1995 to 2024. Interesting funeral, Mom," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. "Nice turnout. Though I have to say, reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated." Linda rushed toward me then, arms outstretched, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, thank God. Thank God you're alive. There must have been some terrible mistake. The military, they told me. They said you were gone." I stepped back before she could embrace me, and I saw her arms fall awkwardly to her sides. Around us, people began to murmur, confused whispers filling the air. Someone was already pulling out their phone, probably to call relatives who hadn't made it to the service. "What mistake would that be, exactly?" I asked quietly, pulling a folded piece of paper from my jacket pocket. It was a printout I'd discovered online during my bus ride home, a GoFundMe page, with my photo and a heartbreaking story about my ultimate sacrifice for my country. $40,847 raised, of $50,000 goal. It read, "Help Linda Costa with funeral costs and grief counseling after losing her heroic son." I held up the paper so everyone could see it. "Because according to this, you've been pretty busy planning my funeral and collecting donations for 8 months now." The murmur turned into a gasp, then an angry buzz. I watched my mother's face cycle through emotions faster than a slot machine. Panic, desperation, and finally, something that looked almost like resignation. Standing in that community center, surrounded by the wreckage of my mother's lies, my mind drifted back to when I first understood what kind of person Linda Costa really was. I was 12, and she'd pulled the same manipulative playbook, just on a smaller scale. It was the week before Christmas, and we were barely scraping by in our cramped apartment. My younger sister Maya was 8, my brother Carlos was 10, and I was the oldest, already feeling the weight of being the man of the house. Since our father had left 3 years earlier, Linda worked part-time at a grocery store, but she had a gambling problem that consumed whatever money came through our door. That particular week, She'd lost her paycheck at the casino. Again, with no money for rent, groceries, or Christmas presents. Linda did what she always did. She created a crisis and made herself the victim. She called in sick to work, claiming she'd been in a car accident. Then she called the church, sobbing about being a single mother, struggling to provide for her children during the holidays. I remember watching her rehearse her story in the bathroom mirror, perfecting the tremor in her voice, the way her eyes would well up with tears on command. She'd even given herself a small bruise on her forehead, with makeup to sell the car accident story. The church responded with an emergency collection that raised over $2,000. But instead of using the money for rent and food like she'd promised the congregation, Linda spent half of it at the casino. Convinced she could win back enough to solve all our problems permanently, she lost it all in one night, then used the remainder to buy herself a new outfit and take her boyfriend at the time out to expensive dinners. When the eviction notice came the following week, she played the victim again, this time blaming the landlord for being heartless and the church for not giving enough. Somehow, she managed to spin the story so that everyone felt sorry for her, while my siblings and I packed our belongings into garbage bags, preparing for another move to another rundown apartment. That's when I found the photo album she kept, hidden under her mattress. It was filled with pictures of Maya, Carlos, and me, but something was off about the arrangement. Maya's photos were front and center, professional school pictures, candid shots of her smiling and playing. Carlos had a decent section too, but my photos were relegated to the back pages, mostly group shots where I happened to be included. Looking through that album, at 12 years old, I realized something that would shape the rest of my childhood. I was different from my siblings in my mother's eyes. Maya was her precious baby girl who could do no wrong. Carlos was her charming boy who inherited her gift for storytelling. But me, I was useful when she needed someone to blame, or when she required a sob story about raising a difficult eldest child. The pattern became clear over the next few years. When Linda needed sympathy from neighbors, I was the troubled teenager acting out because of his father's abandonment. When she wanted to impress new boyfriends, I was the responsible young man helping raise his younger siblings. When money was tight, she'd hint to relatives that I was getting into trouble and needed guidance. Code for cash to keep me on the straight and narrow. I learned to read her moods like weather patterns, the way she'd position herself when telling stories, making sure to angle her body just right to catch the light, how she'd touch her throat when she wanted to appear vulnerable, or place her hand over her heart when she was really selling the emotion. She was a master manipulator, and she'd been training for my fake death her entire adult life. Maya and Carlos never saw it, probably because they were her favorites. They got the genuine versions of maternal love, the bedtime stories, the proud moments, the protection from her worst impulses. I got the performance version, the one where I was a prop in her ongoing drama, rather than her actual son. By the time I turned 16, I'd started planning my escape. The military seemed like the most logical choice: structure, purpose, and, most importantly, distance from Linda's toxic orbit. I knew that if I stayed, I'd either become an enabler like my siblings, or a target for her increasingly elaborate schemes. Looking back now, I could see how perfectly my deployment to Afghanistan had set up her greatest performance yet. A son in a war zone was the ultimate sympathy magnet. She could milk that story for months, collecting prayers, casseroles, and probably small donations from well-meaning friends and neighbors. When my letters became less frequent due to my actual combat duties, she must have seen an opportunity to perfect a pass-up. After all, a dead hero son was worth so much more than a living one who might come home and expose her lies. The Army recruitment office felt like a sanctuary the day I walked in at 17. Still needing Linda's signature because I was a minor. I'd been working part-time at a mechanics shop after school, saving every penny I could for my escape plan. But college seemed impossible with our financial situation, and my grades suffering from the constant chaos at home. Sergeant Martinez, the recruiter, was a straight-talking man in his 30s, who didn't try to sell me some Hollywood version of military life. He laid out the reality: the training would be brutal. Deployment was likely given the ongoing conflicts overseas, and military life wasn't for everyone. But he also talked about purpose, brotherhood, and the chance to build something meaningful with my life. "You sure this isn't just about getting away from home, son?" he asked during our second meeting, studying my enlistment papers. "Because if that's all this is, there are easier ways to leave town." I thought about his question seriously. Was I just running away? Maybe partially. But sitting in that recruiting office, surrounded by photos of soldiers serving around the world. I felt something I'd never experienced at home, a sense of belonging to something larger than myself. It's not just about leaving, I told him honestly. It's about becoming someone I can be proud of. When I brought the papers home for Linda's signature, her reaction was everything I'd expected, and worse. She alternated between tears and rage, accusing me of abandoning the family when they needed me most. She played every card in her manipulation deck: guilt, fear, emotional blackmail. "How can you do this to your mother?" she sobbed, collapsing dramatically onto the couch. "Haven't I sacrificed everything for you kids? And this is how you repay me, by running off to get yourself killed in some foreign desert." But something interesting happened during that performance. Maya, now 12, looked uncomfortable with Linda's theatrics. Carlos, 14, actually spoke up in my defense. "Maybe Danny has a right to make his own choices," he said quietly, earning himself a withering glare from Linda. "Don't you start," she snapped. "I won't lose another child to this family's selfishness." The another child reference was about our father, and how his abandonment was somehow equivalent to my desire to serve my country. It was classic Linda framing every situation to make herself the perpetual victim. In the end, she signed the papers, but not before extracting her price. She made me promise to send money home monthly, to call every week without fail, and to make sure the family got proper credit for having a son in the military. Even my service had to benefit her image somehow. The night before I left for basic training, Linda threw a going-away party that was more about her than me. She invited everyone she could think of, playing the role of the brave, supportive mother sending her firstborn off to defend America. She wore a small American flag pin on her dress and spoke eloquently about sacrifice and duty. "I'm so proud of my son," she announced to the gathered neighbors and relatives. "It breaks my heart to see him go, but I know he's going to make us all proud over there." I watched her performance with a mixture of admiration and disgust. She was genuinely talented at this, the way she could transform any situation into an opportunity for sympathy and attention. Part of me wondered if she even realized she was doing it anymore, or if the manipulation had become so ingrained that it was simply her default mode of interaction. Uncle Frank pulled me aside that night, away from the party crowd. "You sure about this, nephew?" he asked, his voice heavy with concern that seemed more genuine than anything I'd heard from Linda all evening. "I'm sure, Uncle Frank. It's time." He studied my face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Just remember, you don't owe anyone your whole life, not even family. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is save yourself." Those words would echo in my mind throughout my military service, especially during the lonely nights when Linda's letters would arrive filled with financial emergencies and emotional manipulation. She'd write about being a military mom at church, basking in the sympathy and respect that came with having a son deployed overseas. She'd mention casually how expensive things were, how hard it was managing without my help, how proud everyone was of our soldier. The guilt worked for a while. I dutifully sent money home every month, called when I could, and wrote letters that Linda could share with anyone who would listen. But as the months passed and my perspective broadened, I began to see our family dynamic more clearly. My fellow soldiers talked about their families with love and pride, sharing stories that revealed healthy relationships built on mutual respect and genuine affection. I realized I'd never had that with Linda. Our relationship had always been transactional. Provided her with material for her victim narrative, and she provided me with conditional approval that could be withdrawn at any moment. Even from thousands of miles away, I was still just a character in her ongoing drama, the devoted son whose sacrifice made her look good to the community. When I made the decision to extend my deployment and limit my communication home, it wasn't about abandoning my family. It was about finally stepping off the stage of Linda's perpetual performance and discovering who I might be when I wasn't playing a role in her script. Afghanistan wasn't the Hollywood war movie I'd imagined as a teenager. It was dust and heat and boredom punctuated by moments of absolute terror. But it was also brotherhood, purpose, and the first time in my life I felt like I truly belonged. Somewhere I served with the 3rd Infantry Division, stationed at Forward Operating Base Shank in Logar Province. Our mission was route clearance finding and disarming the improvised explosive devices that Taliban fighters planted along roads, used by military convoys and Afghan civilians. It was dangerous, methodical work that required absolute focus and trust in your teammates. My squad leader, Staff Sergeant Williams, was a career soldier from Georgia who treated every mission like a chess game. IEDs aren't random, he'd tell Us during briefings. They're placed strategically. Think like your enemy, and you might live long enough to go home. For the first time in my life, I was part of a team where everyone's survival depended on everyone else doing their job properly. There was no room for Linda's manipulative games. No space for emotional blackmail or victim narratives, either. You performed your duties competently, or people died. The clarity was almost refreshing. I found myself writing fewer letters home as the months passed. Partially because operational security limited what I could share, but mostly because I was discovering an identity that had nothing to do with being Linda Costa's eldest son. Here, I was Specialist Costa, someone my teammates could count on. Someone who'd earned respect through competence and reliability rather than family drama. The day that changed everything started like any other patrol. We were clearing Route Blue, a supply road that connected to FOBs, when our metal detectors picked up suspicious readings near a culvert about 15 kilometers from base. Williams called for the explosive ordnance disposal team. While my squad established security around the potential device, I was manning the radio, coordinating with our backup unit, when Private Johnson spotted movement in the tree line about 200 meters to our north. 3 figures, possibly carrying weapons, moving parallel to our position. Contact left. Williams called out calmly. Everyone stayed focused on your sectors. That's when everything went wrong. The figures in the trees weren't the primary threat, they were a distraction. While we were watching them, someone triggered the eye we'd been trying to clear. Not the device under the road, but a secondary charge hidden in the culvert wall, designed to catch the disposal team. The explosion lifted our vehicle 3 feet off the ground and filled the world with fire and smoke. I remember flying through the air, my ears ringing so loudly I couldn't hear my own voice when I tried to call out. I landed hard against a concrete barrier, my left side taking the full impact. When I regained consciousness, Corman Hayes was working on my injuries, while Williams coordinated a medevac helicopter. My hearing was gone in my left ear, and something was wrong with my leg. Could see blood soaking through my pants, but couldn't feel any pain yet. Stay with me, Costa Hayes kept saying, though his voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. You're going to be fine. Just a ticket home, nothing more. But as I lay there waiting for the helicopter, all I could think about was how Linda would react to news of my injury. Not with genuine concern for my well-being, but with excitement about the sympathy it would generate. I could already imagine her telling the story her heroic son, wounded in service to his country, needing his mother's care and support. It would be emotional gold for her. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I'd finally found a place where I mattered for who I was rather than what I represented, and an IED was sending me back to a world where I'd once again become a prop in Linda's performance. The medical evacuation took me first to the field hospital at Bagram, then to Landstuhl in Germany, and finally to Walter Reed in Washington. The injuries were serious but not career-ending: partial hearing loss, nerve damage in my left leg that would require months of physical therapy, and traumatic brain injury that manifested as severe headaches and occasional disorientation. The doctors recommended medical discharge. My hearing loss made me unsuitable for continued infantry service, and the TBI symptoms were unpredictable enough to make deployment risky. After 4 years in the Army, my military career was over. The discharge paperwork included recommendations for continued treatment at a VA rehabilitation center. The counselor who processed my case, a kind woman named Dr. Patricia Chen, suggested a residential program in Arizona that specialized in helping combat veterans transition back to civilian life. It's not just about physical recovery, she explained. Reintegration can be challenging, even under the best circumstances. This program gives you time and space to process everything that's happened and plan for what comes next. I accepted the placement, but I made one crucial decision. I wouldn't tell my family where I was going or when I'd be back. The paperwork would show I'd been medically discharged and was receiving treatment, but no specific location or timeline. For the first time in my adult life, I was going to take time for myself, without worrying about how it affected Linda's narrative. I told myself it was because I wanted to surprise them when I was fully recovered. But deep down, I think I knew I needed space to figure out who Danny Costa was supposed to be when he wasn't playing a role in someone else's drama. If I'd known what Linda would do with that information gap, I might have made different choices. Then again, maybe what happened next was inevitable. Some people are so committed to being the center of attention that they'll sacrifice anything, including their own children, to maintain their starring role. I would later learn that Linda's descent into her most elaborate lie began with a simple miscommunication. When the army contacted her about my medical discharge, she somehow convinced herself or chose to believe that the official language about my change in status meant something far more final than it actually did. The notification letter, which I found among her papers months later, was straightforward. We regret to inform you that your son, Specialist Daniel Costa, has been medically discharged following injuries sustained during combat operations. He is receiving appropriate medical care and rehabilitation services. Due to privacy regulations, we cannot provide specific details about his condition or treatment location without his written consent. Most parents would have called the contact number provided, demanded more information, or hired a lawyer if necessary. Linda chose a different path entirely. According to my siblings, the first signs of her deception appeared about 2 weeks after she received the notification. Maya found her sitting at the kitchen table with the letter spread out in front of her, surrounded by crumpled tissues, staring at the official Department of Defense letterhead, like she was trying to decode a secret message. "Mom, what's wrong?" Maya had asked. She was 16 now, old enough to sense when Linda was building toward one of her performances. "They won't tell me anything about Danny," Linda replied, her voice hollow with what sounded like genuine grief. "The letter says he was injured, but they won't say how badly or where he is. What if he's in some vegetative state somewhere? What if they're keeping the worst from me?" Over the following days, Linda's speculation grew darker and more detailed. She began calling other military families from our area, comparing notes about notification procedures and casualty reports. She researched military hospitals, casualty notification protocols, and victim family support services, with the thoroughness of someone writing a doctoral thesis. That's when she discovered that families of deceased service members received different notifications than families of injured ones. The realization seemed to crystallize something in her mind. If the military was being vague about my condition, maybe there was something they weren't telling her. And if there was something they weren't telling her, maybe it was because the truth was too terrible to share. The logic was twisted but perfectly Linda. Rather than seeking clarity, she chose to embrace the worst possible interpretation because it served her emotional needs. A son in rehabilitation was temporary sympathy. A son who might never recover was long-term tragedy. But a dead son, that was permanent victim status. The kind of loss that guaranteed perpetual attention and support from everyone around her. She started with small hints too. Neighbors and co-workers. She'd mentioned that she hadn't heard from me in weeks. That the military was being suspiciously vague about my condition. She'd break down crying at random moments, explaining that she had terrible fears about what might have happened to me, but couldn't bring herself to voice them. Uncle Frank later told me that he'd offered multiple times to help her contact the military for more information, to hire a lawyer, if necessary, or even to pay for a trip to whatever hospital I was in. But Linda deflected every offer of actual help, while accepting every expression of sympathy. The fake death notification letter was a masterpiece of manipulation. Using official Department of Defense letterhead, she'd somehow obtained, or forged. Linda created a document that informed her of my death in an IED explosion in Logar province. The letter included specific details, the date, the location, even the names of other casualties from a real incident. She'd researched online, but the most chilling part was how she tailored the language to maximize her own suffering. The letter didn't just announce my death. It apologized for the delay in notification due to the extensive nature of Specialist Costa's injuries and the need for positive identification. It explained that my remains would be returned home for burial, but that the condition of the body would require a closed casket service. She showed this letter to Maya and Carlos first, watching their devastation with what Maya later described as an unsettling combination of grief and satisfaction. Their genuine shock and sorrow seemed to validate the reality of her deception, making it easier to expand the lie to the extended family and community. The funeral arrangements were elaborate and expensive, exactly the kind Linda had always dreamed of, but never been able to afford for any real occasion. She selected a casket, chose a burial plot, hired a pastor, and ordered flowers, all while setting up the GoFundMe page that would supposedly help cover these costs. But the genius of her scheme wasn't in the funeral planning. It was in the way she positioned herself as the grieving military mother. She joined online support groups for Gold Star families. She attended community events honoring fallen soldiers. She spoke at church about the sacrifice her family had made for America. Every appearance generated more sympathy, more donations, and more attention. The local newspaper ran a feature story about her strength in the face of loss. The VFW Post made her an honorary member. The mayor presented her with a key to the city during a Memorial Day ceremony. For 8 months, Linda lived the role of the grieving mother with such commitment that even she might have started believing it was real. She kept my bedroom exactly as I'd left it, created a memorial corner in the living room with my photos and military awards, and spoke about me in the past tense with such convincing sadness that no one questioned the authenticity of her loss. The only flaw in her performance was that she'd never actually confirmed my death through official channels. She'd created a beautiful, tragic fiction, but she'd never taken the steps that would have exposed the lie, like requesting my military records, contacting my unit directly, or trying to claim my life insurance benefits. It was as if part of her knew the truth but had chosen to live in the more emotionally satisfying version of reality she'd created. In Linda's mind, the son who'd left home to escape her manipulation and rarely called anymore was effectively dead anyway. The hero, son who'd died serving his country and made her the center of community sympathy, was so much more useful. The financial success of Linda's lie exceeded even her wildest expectations. What started as a simple GoFundMe page quickly expanded into a multi-platform fundraising empire that generated sympathy donations from sources she'd never even considered. The GoFundMe page itself was professionally crafted, featuring my military portrait alongside heartbreaking text about the ultimate sacrifice I'd made for my country. Linda wrote about the financial burden of funeral expenses, the cost of flying family members in for the service, and her own need for grief counseling to cope with the loss. The initial goal of $15,000 was reached within a week, but Linda quickly realized she'd underestimated her earning potential. She raised the goal to $25,000, then $35,000, then eventually $50,000. Each increase was accompanied by updates about additional expenses: a headstone upgrade, memorial service costs, travel expenses for extended family, and ongoing therapy, needs that seemed to multiply as quickly as the donations rolled in. The beauty of the scheme was how it leveraged other people's genuine desire to help. Military families are revered in our community, and the thought of a Gold Star mother struggling financially was unacceptable to most decent people. Linda wasn't just asking for charity. She was giving people an opportunity to feel good about supporting a worthy cause. Her workplace, the grocery store where she'd been employed part-time for 3 years, organized a collection that raised over $3,000. Her supervisor, Mr. Peterson, later told me he'd been so moved by Linda's courage in returning to work, despite her grief, that he'd personally contributed $500 and encouraged corporate headquarters to match employee donations. The church fundraising was even more elaborate. Pastor Williams organized a memorial potluck dinner where attendees could make donations while sharing memories of our family. Linda gave a speech about faith sustaining her through tragedy that had many congregants in tears. The event raised nearly $5,000, with several elderly parishioners writing substantial checks after being particularly moved by Linda's performance. Social media amplified everything exponentially. Linda joined Facebook groups for military families, Gold Star mothers, and local community pages, sharing her story with increasingly dramatic flair. Each post generated hundreds of sympathetic comments and dozens of additional donations. She learned to time her posts for maximum emotional impact, late at night when she was supposedly unable to sleep due to grief, or early in the morning when she was starting another day without my hero's son. The local veterans organizations were particularly generous. The VFW Post adopted Linda as their honorary Gold Star representative, featuring her in their newsletter and inviting her to speak at memorial events. The American Legion chapter organized a motorcycle ride fundraiser that brought in over $2,000. The Military Family Support Network included her in their annual charity auction. Linda even discovered corporate sponsorship opportunities. Local businesses wanted to demonstrate their support for military families, and what better way than helping a grieving mother? The car dealership where Uncle Frank worked organized a customer appreciation event with proceeds benefiting the Costa Family Fund. A local restaurant hosted a percentage night where all profits from one evening went to Linda's cause. The momentum was intoxicating. Bank statements I later examined showed deposits ranging from small individual contributions of $20 or $50 to major donations of $1,000 or more. Money came from sources Linda had never even contacted directly: friends of friends who'd heard the story, strangers who'd seen her social media posts shared by others, veterans organizations from neighboring towns that wanted to show solidarity. But the real genius was in how Linda managed the money once it started flowing. Rather than putting everything into a single account, where the total might seem suspiciously large, she spread the donations across multiple accounts and platforms: PayPal, Venmo, Cash App, direct bank transfers, and old-fashioned checks and cash donations at events. She kept meticulous records, but in a way that made the full scope of her windfall less obvious to any single person or institution. The spending pattern revealed her priorities clearly. According to the bank records, less than 30% of the donated money went toward anything that could remotely be considered funeral or memorial related. She did purchase a cemetery plot and a modest headstone props that lent credibility to her story and could be visited by sympathetic friends who wanted to pay their respects. But the majority of the money-funded lifestyle improvements Linda had been dreaming about for years. She paid off her car loan, caught up on back rent, bought new furniture, upgraded her wardrobe, and treated herself to regular spa days and expensive dinners. She even took a vacation to Las Vegas, which she justified to inquiring friends as needing to get away and process my grief. The cruelest part was how she used my siblings as unwitting accomplices. Maya and Carlos, genuinely grieving what they believed was my death, became powerful testimonials to Linda's credibility. Their authentic sorrow at community events helped validate her performance and generate even more donations. Maya later told me that people would approach her at school or around town, expressing condolences and sometimes slipping her cash to help your mom during this difficult time. Carlos received similar treatment at his job at the local pizza place, where customers who knew our story would leave extra large tips, specifically for the family that lost their soldier. By the time I walked into that community center 8 months later, Linda had transformed my supposed death into a cottage industry. She'd become a local celebrity of sorts, the brave Gold Star mother who embodied dignity in the face of loss. People recognized her around town, sought her out for advice on dealing with grief, and continued to support her financially, even as the initial surge of sympathy donations began to slow. The memorial service that night wasn't just about maintaining her light. It was a reunion tour, a chance to rekindle the sympathy and reopen the donation streams that had been so profitable. She'd planned it perfectly, right down to the timing. Maya's birthday provided the perfect cover story for gathering the extended family, and a memorial service on that date would have been emotionally devastating in just the right way to generate maximum impact on. Instead, she got me walking through the door, very much alive and carrying evidence of every financial transaction she'd made in my name. While Linda was busy building her empire of lies, I was 3 states away, slowly rebuilding myself, at the Desert Hope Veterans Rehabilitation Center in Tucson, Arizona. The facility sat on 40 acres of desert landscape, surrounded by mountains that turned purple at sunset, and saguaro cacti that stood like silent sentinels against the endless sky. My daily routine was structured around healing, both physical and psychological. Morning physical therapy with Martinez, a former Marine who'd lost his left arm to an IED in Iraq and had no patience for self-pity. Afternoon sessions with Dr. Sarah Kim, a psychologist who specialized in combat trauma and had a gift for helping veterans untangle the complex web of emotions that followed them home from war. Recovery isn't linear, Dr. Kim would remind me during our sessions. Some days you'll feel like you're making progress. Other days you'll feel like you're moving backward. Both experiences are normal and necessary. The hearing loss in my left ear was permanent, but I learned to compensate. The nerve damage in my leg responded well to physical therapy, though I'd always walk with a slight limp. The traumatic brain injury was more unpredictable. Some days I felt sharp and focused. Other days, the headaches were so severe I couldn't get out of bed. But it was the psychological work that proved most challenging and most valuable. For the first time in my life, I had a trained professional helping me examine the patterns that had shaped my relationships and choices. Dr. Kim was particularly interested in my family dynamics, sensing something unhealthy in the way I described my interactions with Linda. "Tell me about your mother's reaction when you enlisted," she said during one of our early sessions. I described Linda's dramatic performance, the tears and accusations, the way she'd made my decision to serve my country, about her own abandonment and suffering. "How did that make you feel?" Dr. Kim asked. "Guilty, mostly. Like I was being selfish for wanting something different than what she wanted for me." And now, looking back, do you think that guilt was justified? It was a simple question that opened up months of difficult conversations. We talked about emotional manipulation, about the difference between healthy family bonds and toxic and we discussed my tendency to take responsibility for other people's emotions and my difficulty setting boundaries with people who claimed to love me. Your mother trained you to be responsible for her emotional well-being, Dr. Kim explained. That's not normal or healthy. Children shouldn't have to manage their parents' feelings or provide material for their parents' victim narratives. The revelation was both liberating and terrifying. If I wasn't responsible for Linda's happiness, what was my role in the family? If I didn't have to feel guilty for pursuing my own goals, what did that mean about all the years I'd spent trying to be the son she wanted me to be? My fellow veterans at Desert Hope became the brothers. I'd never had men and women who understood the unique challenges of transitioning from military structure to civilian ambiguity. There was Rodriguez, a Navy veteran who'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan and was dealing with survivor's guilt after losing his best friend to a suicide bomber. Williams, an Air Force mechanic who'd developed severe anxiety after witnessing a helicopter crash during a supply run. Chen, a former Army medic, who couldn't sleep without reliving the faces of soldiers she couldn't save. We formed an informal support group that met most evenings on the center's back patio, sharing stories and insights that helped each of us process our experiences. These conversations were different from the ones I'd had with my military unit DAPA. More vulnerable, focused on healing rather than just surviving. The hardest part isn't what happened over there, Rodriguez said one evening as we watched the sunset paint the mountains orange and gold. It's figuring out how to be normal people again when you feel like you left pieces of yourself in the desert. Maybe that's the point, Williams replied. Maybe we're not supposed to go back to who we were before. Maybe we're supposed to become something different. I started writing during my time at Desert Hope, not letters home, but journal entries that helped me process my experiences and emotions. Dr. Kim had suggested it as a therapeutic tool, but it became something more. Writing helped me separate my own thoughts and feelings from the narratives I'd been carrying around about duty, family, and identity. One entry, dated about 6 months into my rehabilitation, captured a moment of clarity that surprised me with its simplicity. I realize today that I haven't called home in 3 weeks, and I don't feel guilty about it. That might be the first time in my entire life I've put my own recovery ahead of someone else's emotional needs. It feels strange, but also right. The rehabilitation program was designed to last anywhere from 6 months to a year, depending on individual progress. By month 7, I was functioning well enough to consider my next steps. The counselors helped me explore options: education, vocational training, direct transition to civilian employment, or even returning to military service in a different capacity. But I found myself thinking more and more about home. Not Linda's version of home, with all its drama and manipulation, but the parts of my family that I genuinely missed. Maya, who would be turning 16 soon. Carlos, who was finishing high school, and probably wondering why his big brother had basically disappeared. Even Uncle Frank, who'd always been more of a father figure to me than anyone else in the family. I started planning a surprise visit for Maya's birthday. She'd always been my favorite sibling, the one who seemed least affected by Linda's toxic patterns. I imagined showing up at her party, fully recovered and ready to be a real big brother for the first time in years. The surprise would be a chance to reconnect with the family members who mattered while showing Linda that I'd not only survived my injuries but thrived. Despite them, Dr. Kim was supportive but cautious about my plan. Make sure you're going home for the right reasons, she advised during one of our final sessions. Are you returning because you're ready to have healthy relationships with your family? Or because you're still trying to prove something to your mother? It was a fair question that I thought about during my last weeks at Desert Hope. The truth was probably a mixture of both motivations, but I felt stronger and more self-aware than I'd ever been. The daily structure of rehabilitation had given me tools for managing my physical limitations and my emotional triggers. I'd learned to recognize manipulation tactics and set boundaries without feeling guilty about prioritizing my own well-being. Most importantly, I'd discovered who Danny Costa was when he wasn't performing a role in someone else's drama. I was someone who enjoyed quiet moments watching desert sunsets, who found satisfaction in helping fellow veterans work through their struggles, who could have deep conversations about purpose and meaning without needing to prove anything to anyone. The night before I left Desert Hope, my informal support group threw me a going-away gathering on the back patio. We shared stories, contact information, and promises to stay in touch. Rodriguez gave me a small wooden cross he'd carved during his woodworking therapy sessions. For protection, he said with a grin. Something tells me you're going to need it where you're going. Chen, ever practical, made me promise to call if I needed someone to talk to who understood the transition challenges. Family stuff can be just as triggering as combat memories, she warned. Don't try to handle everything alone. Williams just gave me a firm handshake and a piece of advice that would prove prophetic. Remember, you can't control other people's reactions to your recovery. You can only control how you respond to theirs. I took a Greyhound bus from Tucson to Los Angeles, then another from LA, back to my hometown. The journey gave me time to think about what I wanted to say to my family, how I wanted to handle the inevitable emotional reactions, and what boundaries I needed to maintain to protect the progress I'd made. I'd purchased a small gift for my silver necklace with a charm shaped like a compass, engraved with the words "Find Your True North." It seemed appropriate for a girl who was navigating the complicated territory of adolescence, while dealing with what she believed was the loss of her big brother. The bus pulled into the station on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 days before Maya's birthday party. I deliberately arrived early to give myself time to adjust to being back in familiar surroundings. Before the emotional intensity of surprising my family, I checked into a small motel near downtown, planning to spend a couple of days walking around town, visiting places that held good memories, and mentally preparing for what I hoped would be a joyful reunion. I had no idea that Linda had planned a memorial service for the same night as Maya's birthday party, or that my timing would transform what I'd imagined as a surprise celebration into the most dramatic confrontation of my life. The invitation that brought me home, at exactly the wrong or perhaps exactly the right moment, came from Maya herself, though she had no idea she was sending it. I'd been following her social media accounts sporadically during my rehabilitation, careful not to engage, but wanting to stay connected to her life from a distance. 3 weeks before her 16th birthday, she posted about the party Linda was planning for her. The post was excited, but also slightly awkward, mentioning how her mother wanted to make this birthday extra special, because it would be the first one since losing Danny. Maya wrote about feeling conflicted wanting to celebrate, but feeling guilty about being happy when the family was supposedly still grieving. Reading that post broke my heart. My little sister was carrying emotional weight that wasn't hers to bear, feeling guilty for normal teenage joy because she thought her big brother was dead. It confirmed everything Dr. Kim had been telling me about Linda's toxic patterns. Even in my supposed death, I was being used to manipulate my siblings' emotions. I made the decision that night to surprise Maya for her birthday. The plan was simple: arrive unannounced at what I assumed would be a typical family party, reveal that I was alive and recovered, and give Maya the best 16th birthday gift possible, her brother back from the dead. I'd spent hours planning the perfect entrance. I'd wear my dress uniform. I'd brought it with me when I left for rehabilitation, thinking I might need it for some formal occasion during my recovery. I'd arrive just as the party was getting started, probably walk in while they were singing "Happy Birthday," and watch Maya's face light up with joy and disbelief. The bus ride home was filled with anticipation and nervous energy. I rehearsed what I'd say, how I'd explain my long absence without going into details about Linda's lies, which, at that point, I knew nothing about. I planned to tell them about my injuries and rehabilitation, apologize for not staying in better contact, and focus on rebuilding our relationships moving forward. I'd even written a speech of sorts, practicing it in my head during the long hours of travel. Surprise! I know I've been MIA for a while, but I wanted to be completely recovered before I came home. I didn't want anyone to worry about me, so I kept my location and condition private while I worked on getting better. But I couldn't miss Maya's 16th birthday. Some things are more important than privacy. It seemed perfect. Maya would get her brother back, the family would be reunited, and Linda would have to deal with the reality that her eldest son had grown up and learned to prioritize his own healing. I imagined it would be emotional, but ultimately joyful tears of relief rather than grief. Celebration rather than mourning. The 3 days I spent in town before the party were surreal. I walked through neighborhoods where I'd grown up, visited the high school I'd attended, stopped by the mechanic's shop where I'd worked before enlisting. Everything looked smaller than I remembered, but also more peaceful. The dramatic intensity that had characterized my adolescence seemed to have been replaced by a quiet normalcy that I found comforting. I avoided places where I might run into people who knew me, not wanting to spoil the surprise. I spent most of my time at the local library, reading and planning, or walking in the park where Maya and I used to play when she was little. I bought her birthday gift at a jewelry store downtown, carefully selecting the compass necklace and having it engraved, with a message that seemed appropriate: to help you find your way. Love, your big brother. Friday evening, the night of Maya's party. I put on my dress uniform and drove the rental car I'd picked up at the bus station toward the community center where Linda had told relatives the party would be held. I'd seen the location mentioned in Maya's social media posts and assumed it meant she was having a bigger celebration than usual maybe. Linda had finally done something genuinely nice for one of her children. I parked outside the community center at 7:30 p.m., expecting to hear music and laughter from inside. Instead, the building seemed unusually quiet. A few cars were in the parking lot, but not the crowd I'd expected for a Sweet 16 party. I checked Maya's social media one more time to make sure I had the right location and time. Her most recent post, from earlier that afternoon, was strange. "Tonight is going to be really hard. But Mom says it's important to honor Danny's memory on my birthday, since he always made it special. I just wish he could be here." Memory. Honor. Those weren't words associated with birthday parties. Something was wrong, but I couldn't figure out what. Maybe Linda had decided to do some kind of memorial moment during the party, a toast to my memory or something equally dramatic. It would be just like her to inject her own agenda into Maya's celebration. I grabbed Maya's gift from the passenger seat, took a deep breath, and walked toward the community center entrance. Through the glass doors, I could see people sitting in folding chairs arranged in rows facing the front of the room. It looked more like a meeting or presentation than a party. Then I saw the easel with my enlarged photograph surrounded by flowers, and everything clicked into place. This wasn't Maya's birthday party. This was my funeral. For a moment, I stood, frozen in the doorway, trying to process what I was seeing. My own face smiled back at me from beyond the grave, surrounded by white lilies and red carnations. People I recognized, neighbors, relatives, family friends, sat in hushed conversation, many dabbing at their eyes with tissues. And at the front of the room, dressed in black and accepting condolences, like a professional mourner, was Linda, my mother, who had somehow decided that her son was more valuable to her dead than alive. The rage that filled me in that moment was unlike anything I'd experienced. Even in combat, this wasn't just betrayal, it was theft. She'd stolen 8 months of my life, stolen my relationships with my siblings, stolen my identity, and transformed it into a commodity for her own benefit. But underneath the rage was something else, a kind of grim satisfaction. Because I was about to give Linda Costa the performance of her lifetime, one she'd never forget and never be able to spin in her favor. I pushed open the door and stepped into my own memorial service. The chaos that erupted when I walked into that memorial service was like nothing I'd ever witnessed. Mrs. Rodriguez's scream seemed to trigger a domino effect of shock that rippled through the room in waves. Each person's reaction building on the last until the entire gathering descended into pandemonium. Maya was the second person to see me, and her reaction nearly broke my heart. She'd been sitting in the front row between Carlos and Uncle Frank, clutching a framed photo of the two of us from her 13th birthday. When she looked up and saw me standing in the doorway, the photo slipped from her hands and shattered on the floor. "Danny," she whispered, her voice so quiet I almost couldn't hear it over the growing commotion. Then louder, standing up so fast her chair fell backward. "Danny." She ran toward me with the desperate speed of someone who thought she might be hallucinating. When she threw her arms around me, sobbing so hard her whole body shook, I realized this was the first genuine emotion I'd witnessed all evening. Everyone else's shock seemed performative somehow, but Maya's grief and relief were absolutely real. "I thought you were dead," she sobbed into my chest. "Mom said you were dead. The military said you were dead. I've been so sad for so long. And you're here. You're really here. I'm here. Little sister," I said, holding her tight and fighting back my own tears. "I'm alive, and I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Carlos reached us next, and for a moment, we were a huddle of 3 siblings reuniting after what they believed had been the most tragic loss of their lives. Carlos, now 17 and taller than me, kept touching my face like he needed physical proof that I wasn't a ghost. "How are you here?" he kept asking. "How are you alive?" "Mom showed us the letter from the army. We had a funeral. We buried—" He stopped, confusion replacing relief. "What did we bury?" It was Uncle Frank who answered that question, his voice cutting through the noise of the crowd like a blade. "They buried an empty casket," he said, walking toward us with an expression I'd never seen on his face before, a mixture of relief, rage, and something that looked like disgust. "Because Linda never had a body to bury. Because there never was a body." He stopped in front of Linda, who had gone completely white and seemed to be having trouble breathing. "Isn't that right, Linda?" You never actually confirmed Danny's death through official channels, did you? You just took some vague notification about his medical discharge and turned it into the performance of a lifetime. The crowd, which had been buzzing with confused excitement about my miraculous return, suddenly went silent. The implications of Uncle Frank's words were sinking in, and the mood in the room shifted from celebration to something much darker. "Frank, you don't understand," Linda started, but her voice was shaky and unconvincing. "The military told me." "The military told you he was injured and receiving medical treatment," Uncle Frank interrupted. "I called them myself 3 months ago because something didn't seem right about your story. They couldn't give me details because of privacy laws, but they confirmed he was alive and receiving care at a VA facility." A collective gasp went through the room. Several people stood up, looking back and forth between Linda and me, like they were trying to solve a puzzle. I heard someone say GoFundMe, and saw others reaching for their phones, probably to check the donation page that was apparently still active. Pastor Williams, who had been sitting near the memorial display, stood up with a look of growing horror on his face. "Linda, are you telling me that Danny has been alive this entire time? That we held a funeral service for a living person? That the church raised money for a tragedy that never happened?" "It's not that simple," Linda said, her voice getting higher and more desperate. "I thought the letter was so vague, and when I couldn't reach him, when did you last try to reach me, Mum?" I asked, my voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "Because I've been at the same VA facility for 8 months, with the same phone number the military gave you. When exactly did you call there looking for your son?" The silence stretched out like a held breath. Linda's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. Around us, I could see the pieces clicking into place for everyone in the room: the elaborate fundraising, the memorial services, the months of sympathy and attention, all built on a lie so audacious that nobody had thought to question it. "You never called," I continued, pulling out my phone and showing the screen to the room, "because you have my contact information right here in your phone. You've had it the whole time. You just chose not to use it, because a dead son was worth more to you than a living one." That's when Linda collapsed into one of the folding chairs, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking completely. "You don't understand," she sobbed. "I was so scared when I got that letter. I thought the worst. And when you didn't call, I assumed you assumed what would get you the most attention," Maya said, her voice cold in a way I'd never heard before. She'd stepped away from our family huddle and was staring at Linda with an expression of dawning understanding. "You let me grieve my brother for 8 months. You let me cry myself to sleep thinking he was dead. You made me feel guilty for wanting to celebrate my birthday because I thought it would dishonor his memory." "Maya, honey, you don't understand." "How complicated?" "I understand perfectly," Maya snapped. "You turned my brother's supposed death into your personal drama. You made everyone feel sorry for you. You collected money from people who cared about our family. And the whole time, he was alive, and you knew it was possible he was alive, and you chose not to find out because the truth wasn't as useful to you as the lie." The room erupted in angry voices as the full scope of Linda's deception became clear. People were checking their phones, probably looking at the GoFundMe page and calculating how much money they'd donated. Others were talking about the fundraising events they'd organized, the sympathy meals they'd brought, the emotional support they'd provided to someone who was grieving a loss that never happened. Mr. Peterson from Linda's work stood up, his face red with anger. "I gave you $500, he said. "My wife and I scraped together money we didn't have because we thought you were struggling to bury your son. The whole store organized collections for you. The church raised over $3,000, Pastor Williams added, his voice heavy with betrayal. "We held special prayer services. We put your family on our prayer list. We treated you like a gold star mother, deserving of our community's highest respect and support." But it was Carlos who asked the question that cut deepest. "Mom, what were you going to do when Danny came home? Were you just going to keep pretending he was dead forever?" Linda looked up at him with tears streaming down her face, and for the first time all evening, she seemed to understand that there was no performance that could fix this, no manipulation tactic that could transform her from the villain of this story back into the victim she'd always positioned herself to be. "I don't know," she whispered. "I honestly don't know." The community center began to empty quickly as the full weight of Linda's deception settled over the crowd. People left in small groups, talking in hushed, angry voices about the money they'd donated, the sympathy they'd wasted, the genuine grief they'd felt for a loss that never happened. Some stopped to hug me or shake my hand. expressing relief that I was alive but also embarrassment at being caught up in such an elaborate lie. Within 30 minutes, only family remained me. Maya, Carlos, Uncle Frank, and Linda, who sat slumped in her chair like a marionette with cut strings. The memorial flowers seemed obscene now, their sweet scent filling the air with a sickening reminder of the performance we'd all just witnessed. Uncle Frank was the first to break the heavy silence. Linda, I need you to understand how serious this is. This isn't just family drama anymore. You've committed fraud, multiple felonies. Probably people gave you tens of thousands of dollars based on lies. I know, Linda whispered, not looking up from her hands. I know what I did. Do you? I asked, walking closer to her chair. Because I don't think you understand the scope of what you've stolen. It's not just money, Mom. You stole 8 months of my relationship with Maya and Carlos. You stole their ability to grieve normally when they thought I was actually dead someday. You stole the community's trust and generosity. You turned my military service into a prop for your personal drama. Linda finally looked up at me, and I saw something I'd never seen in her eyes before, genuine shame. Not the performed remorse she'd always used to manipulate her way out of consequences, but real recognition of the damage she'd caused. I wrote you a letter, she said quietly, reaching into her purse and pulling out a handwritten envelope. When I realized what I'd done, when it got too big to take back, I wrote you a letter explaining everything. I never sent it, because I didn't know where you were, but I wrote it. She held the envelope out to me with shaking hands. My name was written on the front, in Linda's familiar handwriting. But the paper was wrinkled and stained, like it had been read and reread many times. Took the letter but didn't open it immediately. When did you write this? 3 months ago. When Uncle Frank told me he'd called the military and they said you were alive. That's when I knew for certain that what I'd done was unforgivable. 3 months ago. Maya's voice was sharp with fresh anger. You knew 3 months ago that Danny was alive, and you still let me go through the worst depression of my life thinking my brother was dead. I didn't know how to stop it, Linda said, fresh tears starting. It had gotten so big, and so many people were involved. And the money, I repeated. Let's talk about the money. Mom, how much did you collect in my memory? Linda's face crumpled. $47,000, maybe more. I lost track of all the different sources. The number hit the room like a physical blow. Uncle Frank whistled, low under his breath. Carlos sat down heavily in one of the folding chairs. Maya just stared at Linda with an expression of complete disbelief. $47,000, I said slowly. What did you spend it on? Living expenses, mostly. The rent, groceries, car payments. That's not living expenses, Mom. That's lifestyle improvements. What did you really spend it on? Linda was quiet for a long moment, then reached into her purse again and pulled out a small notebook. I kept records, she said, handing it to me. I knew this day would come eventually, and I wanted to be able to account for everything. I flipped through the notebook, and the entries painted a clear picture of Linda's priorities. Rent and utilities accounted for maybe 20% of the spending. The rest was restaurants, shopping, spa treatments, a vacation to Las Vegas, new furniture, and what appeared to be regular gambling losses at the local casino. You spent donation money at the casino? I asked, incredulous. I thought if I could win big, I could pay it all back and make everything right, Linda said. I thought I could turn it into enough money to actually help the family long term. By gambling, Uncle Frank's voice was sharp with disbelief. Linda, you gambled away money that people donated to help you bury your son. I was desperate, Linda said. The lie got so big, and I couldn't figure out how to end it without destroying everything. I thought if I could just win enough money to pay everyone back, you would have kept lying, Maya interrupted. Even if you'd won $1 million, you would have kept pretending Danny was dead because it was working for you. You liked being the center of attention. You liked people feeling sorry for you. Linda started to protest, but Carlos cut her off. Maya's right. You've always been like this, Mom. You've always made everything about you, even when it should be about us. But this, he gestured around the room, at the memorial flowers and empty chairs. This is beyond anything you've ever done before. I sat down across from Linda, the letter still unopened in my hands. I want you to explain something to me. Help me understand how you thought this was going to end. Did you plan to fake my death forever? Were you going to have fake annual memorial services? Were you going to keep collecting donations in perpetuity? Linda looked at me with an expression of complete helplessness. I don't know. I kept thinking I'd figure out a way to make it right, But every day that passed made it harder to tell the truth, and people were so kind, so supportive. They treated me like someone important for the first time in my life. So it was about attention. It was about feeling like I mattered, Linda said, her voice barely audible. My whole life, I've felt invisible. Your father left because I wasn't enough. My job treats me like I'm disposable. You kids grew up and stopped needing me. But when I was grieving mother, people cared about me. They sought me out. They wanted to help me. They treated me like someone worthy of respect. The honesty in her admission was more devastating than any lies she could have told. This wasn't about money, or even about attention, exactly. It was about a woman so desperate to feel valued that she was willing to sacrifice her own son's identity to achieve it. Mom, I said quietly, I need you to understand something. What you did to me, to Maya and Carlos, to everyone who cared about our family, it's unforgivable. There are going to be consequences that you can't manipulate your way out of. People are going to demand their money back. Some of them are probably going to press charges. Your relationship with your children is permanently damaged. Linda nodded, tears streaming down her face. I know. I've known for months. That's why I wrote the letter. I wanted you to understand that I know how wrong I was, even if I couldn't figure out how to make it right. I opened the envelope and unfolded several pages of handwritten text. The letter was long, rambling, and filled with a kind of detailed self-reflection that Linda had never been capable of in person. As I read, I realized it might be the most honest thing she'd ever written. Uncle Frank took charge of documenting the full scope of Linda's fraud with the methodical precision of someone who understood that emotional confrontations wouldn't be enough to address what had happened. Over the next 3 days, he helped me create a comprehensive record of every donation, every fundraising event, and every false statement Linda had made about my supposed death. The spreadsheet we compiled was staggering in its detail. 47 individual donations through the GoFundMe page, ranging from $25 to $2,000. Church collections totaling $4,200. Workplace fundraisers, bringing in another $3,800. Veterans organization events contributing $2,700. Corporate sponsorships and community fundraisers adding another $6,000. The total exceeded $52,000. Even more than Linda had initially estimated. Jesus, Danny, Uncle Frank said, scrolling through the bank records Linda had reluctantly provided. She really went all out. Look at this. She set up automatic payment processing through 3 different platforms. She was treating your death like a small business. Each entry told a story of genuine human compassion being exploited. Mrs. Rodriguez had donated her grocery money for 2 weeks. The Peterson family had used funds earmarked for their own son's college tuition. The church youth group had organized a car wash fundraiser, working in the summer heat to raise money for a grieving mother's expenses. But it was the personal messages attached to many of the donations that cut deepest. People had shared their own stories of loss, their gratitude for military families, their desire to help a Gold Star mother through the worst time of her life. One elderly veteran had donated $500 with a note saying, "Lost my own boy in Vietnam. Know how hard it is. This is for his memory." These people didn't just give money. I told Uncle Frank as we worked through the records. They gave pieces of their hearts. They shared their own pain to help someone they thought was suffering like they had suffered. The spending records were equally detailed and far more damning. Linda's notebook contained receipts and transaction records that painted a clear picture of someone who had quickly lost any sense of moral boundaries. Within the first month after starting the fundraising, she was using donation money for luxury purchases that had nothing to do with funeral expenses or grief counseling. $800 at a high-end department store for new clothes. $1,200 for a weekend spa retreat. $650 for dinner at expensive restaurants. $2,400 lost in a single night at the casino. $900 for professional photography sessions to update her social media profiles. The pattern showed someone who had convinced herself that she deserved these luxuries as compensation for her suffering. Most disturbing were the receipts from a local funeral home, evidence that Linda had actually gone through the motions of planning my burial. She'd selected a casket, purchased a burial plot, and paid for a gravestone with my name and military service details. The total cost was nearly $8,000, creating a physical monument to her lie that could be visited by sympathetic friends and relatives. She really committed to this, Uncle Frank said, studying the funeral home receipts. This wasn't a spur of the moment decision or a lie that got out of hand. She planned this elaborately and maintained it systematically. We also discovered that Linda had been far more sophisticated in her deception than I'd initially realized. She'd researched military casualty notification procedures, studied other Gold Star family stories on social media, and even joined online support groups where she shared fabricated details about my supposed death and her grieving process. Her posts in these groups were particularly chilling. She'd written eloquently about the final phone call she never received, the flag presentation ceremony that never happened, and the empty bedroom she couldn't bear to enter. Other grieving families had responded with their own stories, offering comfort and advice to someone they believed was walking the same painful path they had traveled. She wasn't just lying to people who knew our family, I realized as we scrolled through her online activity. She was lying to people who had actually lost children in combat. She was taking comfort and support that should have gone to real Gold Star families. Uncle Frank printed out everything we found, organizing it into categories that would be useful for law enforcement and civil proceedings: financial records, correspondence, social media posts, receipts, and documentation of every false statement Linda had made about my death. "This isn't just fraud," he said as we finished our work. "This is identity theft, wire fraud, and probably a dozen other federal crimes. The military takes false casualty claims very seriously, especially when they're used for financial gain. But, beyond the legal implications, the documentation revealed something even more disturbing about Linda's psychological state. The level of detail in her deception, the consistency of her false narrative over 8 months, and her ability to maintain emotional performances in the face of direct questioning, suggested someone who had lost touch with basic moral boundaries. "Do you think she started believing it herself?" I asked Uncle Frank as we reviewed her most elaborate social media posts. "Some of these stories are so detailed and emotionally convincing. It's like she was living in the reality she'd created." "I think Linda has always had trouble distinguishing between what's true and what's useful," Uncle Frank replied. "But this time, the useful version became so elaborate that even she got lost in it." The most heartbreaking discovery was a series of text messages between Linda and Maya from the weeks after my supposed death. Maya had been struggling with depression and guilt, convinced that she should have somehow prevented my death or done more to support me during my deployment. Linda had not only failed to reassure her daughter that these feelings were unfounded, she had actively encouraged them as a way of validating her own narrative. "Look at this," I said, showing Uncle Frank a message thread from 3 months earlier. Maya had texted Linda saying she felt guilty for laughing at something funny that happened at school, like she was being disrespectful to my memory, instead of telling Maya that it was healthy and normal to experience joy, even while grieving. Linda had responded, "I understand, sweetheart. I feel the same way. Danny would want us to honor his sacrifice by remembering how serious life can be." She used Maya's grief to validate her own performance, Uncle Frank said, his voice heavy with disgust. She encouraged a 16-year-old girl to feel guilty for experiencing normal human emotions, because it made her lie more convincing. By the time we finished our documentation, we had assembled a case file that would have impressed any prosecutor. But more importantly, we had created an accounting of the human cost of Linda's deception, not just the financial damage, but the emotional manipulation of family members, friends, and strangers who had offered genuine compassion to someone they believed was suffering. "What do you want to do with all this?" Uncle Frank asked as we sat surrounded by papers and printouts that documented 8 months of elaborate lies. I thought about Dr. Kim's advice about boundaries and consequences, about the difference between forgiveness and enabling. Linda's behavior wasn't just morally wrong, it was criminal. And more importantly, it was a pattern that would continue unless there were real, unavoidable consequences. "We're going to the police," I said. "And then we're going to make sure everyone who donated money knows exactly what happened and how they can get their money back." Uncle Frank nodded approvingly. "Good. It's time Linda learned that some performances have consequences she can't manipulate her way out of." The confrontation I'd been building toward happened 3 days after the memorial service disaster, in Linda's apartment while Maya and Carlos were at school. I'd arranged to meet her alone, bringing both the documentation Uncle Frank and I had compiled and a digital recorder I'd purchased specifically for this conversation. If Linda was going to confess to the full scope of her crimes, I wanted it on record. Linda answered the door looking like she'd aged a decade in 3 days. Her usually carefully styled hair was unwashed and pulled back in a messy ponytail. She wore the same clothes she'd had on the day before, and her apartment, normally meticulously clean for visitors, was cluttered with tissues, empty coffee cups, and the general debris of someone falling apart. "Danny," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "I wondered when you'd come." I sat down at her kitchen table and placed the recorder between us, making sure she could see it clearly. "I want to talk about what happens next, Mom, and I want you to tell me the truth about everything, when it started, how you planned it, what you were thinking, all of it." Linda stared at the recorder for a long moment, then looked up at me, with an expression that was almost relieved. "You're recording this for the police, aren't you?" "I'm recording this because I need to understand how my own mother could do something this elaborate and cruel. The police will get their own confession when I file charges." "When you file charges," Linda repeated. "Not if." "There's no if, Mom. What you did is criminal fraud on a massive scale. The only question is whether you're going to cooperate and try to make restitution, or whether you're going to force everyone to go through a long, public legal battle." Linda was quiet for several minutes, seeming to weigh her options. Finally, she spoke. "What do you want to know? Start with when you decided I was dead instead of injured." Linda took a shaky breath and began what would become a confession that was more disturbing than I'd anticipated. The decision to fake my death hadn't been a sudden impulse or a misunderstanding that got out of hand. It had been a calculated choice made after careful consideration of her options. "When I got the notification letter from the army, I called the number they provided," she said. "The person I spoke to confirmed that you'd been injured and medically discharged. But they couldn't give me details about your condition or location without your written consent. They said you were receiving appropriate medical care and that I should expect communication from you when you were ready. So you knew I was alive." "I knew you were alive, but I also knew you weren't going to contact me. You never called unless you absolutely had to. You rarely responded to my letters. And when you did communicate, it was always brief and distant. I figured you'd probably come home eventually, but it might be months or even years." Linda got up and made coffee while she talked, her movements automatic and nervous. "That's when I realized I had an opportunity. People were already expressing sympathy about you being injured. Mrs. Rodriguez had brought over a casserole. The church was praying for our family. Your supervisor at the grocery store had asked if there was anything they could do to help. So you decided to escalate it. I decided to see how far I could take it. I started hinting that your injuries might be more serious than I was letting on, that the military was being evasive about your prognosis. People responded with more sympathy, more offers of help. It felt good to be the center of positive attention, for once in my life. The progression from hints to outright lies had taken several weeks," Linda explained. She'd tested each escalation carefully, watching people's reactions and adjusting her story based on what generated the most sympathy and support. When people responded positively to her suggestions that I might not recover, she began implying that I might not survive. When that brought even more attention, she took the final step of announcing my death. "The fake notification letter was the hardest part," she admitted. "I spent weeks researching military casualty procedures, looking at examples online, figuring out what language they used and what details to include. I wanted it to look completely authentic." "Where did you get the official letterhead?" "I bought it online. There are websites that sell replica documents for people who want to replace lost military papers." I told myself I was just creating a prop for a school presentation Maya was doing about military families. The ease with which she'd rationalized each step was chilling. Linda had convinced herself that she wasn't really hurting anyone. I was alive and safely recovering somewhere, even if people didn't know that. The donations were just temporary loans that she'd pay back when I returned home. The sympathy was something she deserved after years of struggling as a single mother. "What were you planning to do when I came home?" I asked. Linda's answer revealed the depth of her delusion. "I thought maybe you wouldn't come home. You'd made it clear that you didn't want to be part of this family anymore. I thought you might just start a new life somewhere else and never contact us again. Then the lie would never have to be exposed. And if I did come home, I thought I'd figure something out. Maybe stage your resurrection as a miracle, like you'd been in a coma and suddenly recovered. Or you'd been a prisoner somewhere and finally escaped. I thought people would be so happy you were alive that they wouldn't ask too many questions about the details." The confession continued, with Linda describing the elaborate web of lies she'd maintained. Across multiple platforms and communities, she'd joined online support groups for Gold Star families, sharing detailed stories about my supposed final days and the impact of my death on our family. She'd participated in memorial events for fallen soldiers, always positioning herself as an example of dignified grief in the face of unbearable loss. The attention was addictive, she admitted. For the first time in my adult life, people sought me out. They wanted to hear my stories. They valued my opinions. They treated me like someone important. I started believing that maybe I deserved it, that all the years I'd struggled and sacrificed as a single mother had earned me this level of respect and support. But it was her description of how she'd manipulated Maya and Carlos that made me understand the true scope of her cruelty. She'd deliberately encouraged their grief, using their genuine sorrow to validate her own performance. When Maya struggled with depression, Linda had suggested that deeper grief showed deeper love. When Carlos began questioning details about my death, Linda had accused him of dishonoring my memory. "You used your own children's pain to make your lie more convincing," I said. "I told myself I was helping them process their emotions in a healthy way," Linda replied. "But you're right. I used their grief to prove to other people that my grief was real." The recording device captured everything, not just Linda's words, but the tone of her voice, the pauses where she seemed to be calculating her responses, the moments where genuine remorse seemed to break through her lifelong pattern of self-justification. By the end of our conversation, I had a complete confession that would satisfy any prosecutor. But more importantly, I had confirmation of something I'd suspected since walking into that memorial service. Linda's actions weren't the result of mental illness or temporary desperation. They were the logical conclusion of a lifetime spent treating other people as props in her personal drama. "What happens now?" Linda asked as I turned off the recorder. "Now you're going to write a letter to everyone who donated money, explaining exactly what you did and offering to pay them back. You're going to take down all the online fundraising pages and memorial posts. You're going to contact every organization that honored you as a Gold Star mother and admit that you lied to them. And then you're going to turn yourself in to the police before I do it for you." Linda nodded, tears streaming down her face. "And after that, you're going to face the consequences of your choices. For the first time in your life, you're not going to be able to manipulate your way out of the mess you created." I stood up to leave, but Linda's voice stopped me at the door. "Danny, do you think you'll ever be able to forgive me?" I turned back to look at her. This woman who had given birth to me, but had never really seen me as anything more than a character in her ongoing performance. "I don't know, Mom. But forgiveness and consequences are two different things. You're going to face the consequences, regardless of whether anyone forgives you." I left her apartment with a recording that would soon become evidence in a criminal case, but also with a strange sense of closure. For the first time in my life, I'd had a completely honest conversation with Linda Costa. It had taken the destruction of our entire family dynamic to make it happen. But at least now I knew exactly who she was and what she was capable of. Detective Maria Gonzalez had been working fraud cases for 12 years. But she later told me that Linda's scheme was one of the most elaborate and emotionally manipulative she'd ever encountered. When Uncle Frank and I walked into the police station with our documentation and Linda's recorded confession, Detective Gonzalez spent 3 hours reviewing the evidence before speaking. "This is federal-level fraud," she said finally, looking up from the spreadsheet we'd compiled. "Wire fraud, mail fraud, identity theft, and potentially military impersonation. The fact that she used fake military casualty notifications makes this a matter for federal prosecutors, not just local law enforcement." The police report she filed that afternoon was 10 pages long and included every piece of evidence we'd gathered. Bank records showing the flow of donation money, screenshots of Linda's social media posts and online fundraising pages, receipts for luxury purchases made with fraud proceeds, text messages showing her manipulation of Maya and Carlos, and the full audio recording of her confession. "Are you prepared for what this is going to mean for your family?" Detective Gonzalez asked me as we finished the paperwork. "Once this becomes public record, it's going to be news. Local media at minimum, possibly national coverage. Your mother is looking at serious federal prison time, and your siblings are going to have to deal with the public embarrassment of having their mother exposed as a fraud." I'd been thinking about that question since the night I walked into my own memorial service. Maya and Carlos were innocent victims in this situation, but they would inevitably suffer consequences for Linda's actions. Their friends, teachers, and community members would know that their mother had perpetrated an elaborate fraud using their brother's supposed death. The stigma would follow them for years. "My siblings deserve to know the truth," I said. "And the people who donated money deserve justice. I can't protect Maya and Carlos from embarrassment at the expense of letting Linda get away with stealing from dozens of people who trusted her." Detective Gonzalez nodded approvingly. I think you're making the right choice, but it's not going to be easy for anyone involved. Linda's arrest happened 2 days later, just as Maya was getting home from school. I'd arranged to be there when it happened, wanting to support my siblings through what I knew would be one of the worst moments of their lives. Carlos was at his job at the pizza place, so it was just Maya and me when the police knocked on Linda's door. Linda answered, wearing the same clothes she'd had on during our recorded conversation, like she'd been sitting in her apartment waiting for this moment. She didn't seem surprised to see Detective Gonzalez and 2 other officers standing on her doorstep with an arrest warrant. Linda Costa, you're under arrest for wire fraud, mail fraud, and theft by deception, Detective Gonzalez said, reading from the warrant. You have the right to remain silent, ... I watched Linda's face as her rights were read, looking for some sign of the dramatic performance that had characterized every other crisis in her life, but there was none. She seemed almost relieved as the handcuffs were placed on her wrists, like she was finally free from the exhausting burden of maintaining her elaborate lie. Maya stood beside me in the hallway, watching her mother being arrested for crimes that seemed impossible to process. Is this really happening? She kept asking. Are they really arresting Mum for pretending you were dead? Yes, I said, putting my arm around her shoulders as Linda was led to the police car. This is really happening. The media attention began. That evening, when the local news ran a story about Linda's arrest, "Local woman arrested for faking son's military death" was the headline, accompanied by Linda's booking photo and my military portrait, the same one that had been displayed at my fake memorial service. By the next morning, the story had been picked up by regional news outlets and several national military news websites. The details were too sensational to ignore. A mother who had faked her son's combat death, collected tens of thousands of dollars in donations, and maintained the lie for 8 months before being exposed when her very much alive son walked into his own memorial service. My phone rang constantly with interview requests from reporters who wanted to hear my side of the story. Veterans advocacy groups reached out to express outrage that someone had exploited sympathy for military families for personal gain. The GoFundMe platform released a statement about their policies for verifying tragedy-related fundraising campaigns, but it was the reaction from people who had donated money that hit hardest. Many of them were genuinely embarrassed that they'd been fooled by Linda's performance. But more than that, they were angry that their compassion had been weaponized against them. Mrs. Rodriguez, our neighbor, who had brought casseroles and donated grocery money, stopped by the apartment to talk to me personally. I gave money I couldn't afford to give, she said, tears in her eyes. I went without things my own family needed because I thought your mother was struggling to bury her son. How do I trust anyone who asks for help again? That question haunted me. Linda's fraud didn't just hurt the immediate victims who lost money, it damaged the community's willingness to help people who might genuinely need support in the future. Every time someone asked for donations for a family tragedy, people would remember Linda Costa and wonder if they were being manipulated again. The legal proceedings moved quickly once federal prosecutors took over the case. Linda's recorded confession eliminated any possibility of pleading not guilty, so her attorney focused on negotiating a plea deal that would minimize her prison sentence in exchange for full cooperation and restitution. The restitution calculation was complex because Linda had spent most of the donated money and had no assets of significant value. Her apartment was rented, her car was worth less than she owed on it, and her savings account contained less than $300. Prosecutors would eventually calculate that she could realistically pay back only about 30% of what she'd stolen, and even that would require her to work for years, while most of her income went to victims. She's looking at 2 to 5 years in federal prison. Linda's public defender told us during a meeting about the plea agreement. The judge will probably consider the fact that she's cooperating and that this was a first offense, but the amount of money involved and the deliberate nature of the fraud are serious aggravating factors. Maya and Carlos struggled to process the reality that their mother would be going to prison for an extended period. They'd already lost one parent when their father left years earlier, and now they were effectively losing their mother to her own criminal behavior. What happens to us while she's in prison? Carlos asked during a family meeting at Uncle Frank's house. Where are we supposed to live? Uncle Frank had already spoken to a family law attorney about guardianship arrangements. You'll live with me, he said. Your mother will probably be transferred to a federal facility several hours away, but we'll arrange regular visits so you can maintain a relationship with her if you want to. If we want to. Maya's voice was sharp with pain. Why wouldn't we want to see our mother? It was a fair question that I didn't know how to answer. Linda was still their mother. despite everything she'd done. But she'd also traumatized them in ways that would take years to process and heal. Whether they chose to maintain a relationship with her during and after her incarceration would be their decision to make as they matured and developed their own understanding of what had happened. The weeks following Linda's arrest tore our family apart in ways I hadn't anticipated. While I'd expected anger and disappointment, I hadn't prepared for how differently Maya and Carlos would process their mother's betrayal or how those differences would create conflict between the three of us just when we needed each other most. Maya's response was immediate and absolute. She refused to visit Linda in jail, declined to take her phone calls, and spoke about her with the kind of cold fury that I recognized from my own darkest moments after walking into that memorial service. "She's not my mother anymore," Maya told me one evening as we sat in Uncle Frank's living room, trying to work through the homework that seemed impossibly trivial, given everything else happening in our lives. Mothers don't psychologically torture their children for 8 months. Mothers don't steal money from grieving people. Whatever Linda Costa is, she's not a mother. Carlos, on the other hand, seemed desperate to find ways to excuse or minimize Linda's behavior. He visited her every week during the brief period before her sentencing, accepted her collect calls from jail, and repeatedly tried to convince Maya and me that we should forgive her. She made a huge mistake, he argued during one particularly heated family discussion. But she's still our mom. She raised us by herself after Dad left. She worked to keep a roof over our heads. This doesn't erase everything else she's done for us. Everything else she's done for us. Maya's voice rose with incredulous anger. "Carlos, she let me think my brother was dead for 8 months. She watched me cry myself to sleep, blame myself for not being a better sister, feel guilty for experiencing any happiness because I thought it was disrespectful to Danny's memory. She used my grief to make her lie more convincing to other people." "No, that was wrong," Carlos said. "But people make mistakes when they're desperate. Mom was struggling financially, and she panicked when she thought something bad had happened to Danny. She knew I was alive," I interrupted. "She knew from the beginning that I was alive and receiving medical treatment. This wasn't a mistake or a panic response. It was a calculated decision to profit from people's sympathy for military families." But Carlos had invested so much emotional energy in maintaining his relationship with Linda that acknowledging the full scope of her manipulation would have required him to completely restructure his understanding of his childhood and family dynamics. It was easier to minimize her crimes than to face the possibility that everything he remembered about growing up might have been tainted by her psychological manipulation. The division between my siblings created a secondary crisis that Uncle Frank and I struggled to navigate. Maya felt betrayed by Carlos's loyalty to Linda, interpreting it as dismissal of her own suffering. Carlos felt attacked by Maya and me for refusing to show Linda compassion during what he saw as the worst period of her life. "You're both being unfair to her," Carlos said during a particularly difficult conversation. "She's in jail, facing prison time, and her children won't even talk to her. Hasn't she suffered enough consequences already?" "No," Maya said flatly. "She hasn't. She stole $50,000 from people who trusted her. She made me believe my brother was dead. She turned our family into a lie that she performed for 8 months. Sitting in jail for a few weeks is not proportional punishment for what she did." The conflict escalated when Carlos began sharing details about his conversations with Linda, including her claims that she was devastated by our rejection, and that her mental health was deteriorating in jail. Whether these claims were true or just another manipulation tactic, they achieved their intended effect. Carlos felt responsible for protecting Linda from additional emotional damage. "She says she understands why you're angry," he reported after one of his visits. "But she hopes that eventually you'll be able to forgive her and have a relationship again. She says she's getting counseling in jail and learning about why she made such terrible choices." "She's manipulating you," I said. "She's using your compassion against you, the same way she used the community's compassion to steal money from them. Not everything is manipulation. Danny, maybe she really is trying to change." Uncle Frank tried to mediate between us, but even he was struggling with his own anger toward Linda, as the family member who had always been most aware of her psychological patterns. He felt guilty for not intervening earlier, when her behavior was damaging but not yet criminal. "I should have seen this coming," he told me during one of our private conversations. "I knew Linda had problems with boundaries and attention-seeking behavior. I should have been watching more closely when you deployed, should have been more involved when she started talking about your supposed death." "You couldn't have predicted this," I assured him. "Nobody could have imagined that she'd go this far." But Uncle Frank's guilt was compounded by his current responsibility for Maya and Carlos, who were both struggling academically and socially as news of Linda's crimes spread through their school and community. Maya had become withdrawn and defensive, snapping at teachers and classmates who offered sympathy or asked questions about her family's situation. Carlos was skipping classes and showing signs of depression that worried his school counselor. The text message threads between my siblings, which Uncle Frank showed me with their permission, revealed the depth of their division. Maya, I can't believe you're still defending her. She's a criminal, Carlos. She stole money from people and used our emotions to do it. Carlos, she's our mother. Maya, she made mistakes, but that doesn't mean we should abandon her when she needs us most. Maya, she abandoned us. She chose money and attention over her own children's well-being. Stop making excuses for her. Carlos, I'm not making excuses. I'm trying to show compassion for someone who obviously has serious problems. Maya, your compassion is enabling her to keep manipulating you. She's probably planning her next lie right now, figuring out how to use your loyalty to get what she wants. Carlos, you're being cruel and vindictive. This isn't who you used to be. Maya, maybe this is who I've always been, and you just never saw it, because Mom taught us to hide our real feelings, to protect her fake image. Reading those exchanges broke my heart, because I could see valid points on both sides. Maya's anger was justified and probably necessary for her psychological healing, but Carlos's desire to maintain some kind of family connection was also understandable, especially for someone who had already lost one parent and was facing the prospect of losing another. The situation reached a crisis point when Carlos asked if he could use money from his part-time job to contribute to Linda's legal defense fund. His public defender was overworked and underpaid, and Carlos had convinced himself that better legal representation might keep Linda from going to prison. Absolutely not, Uncle Frank said when Carlos brought up the idea. You're not using your money to help someone who defrauded the community for tens of thousands of dollars. It's my money, Carlos argued, and she's my mother. I should be able to help her if I want to. She's a convicted fraud who used your grief to make her crimes more convincing, Maya said. Helping her is like rewarding her for what she did. To us, the argument that followed was the worst fight our family had ever experienced. With years of suppressed resentment and pain erupting in accusations and counter-accusations that left everyone emotionally raw, Carlos accused Maya and me of being vindictive and unforgiving. Maya accused Carlos of being naive and easily manipulated. I found myself caught between wanting to support both of my siblings while also dealing with my own complex feelings about Linda's betrayal. By the end of that conversation, it was clear that our family would never return to whatever normal had been before Linda's crimes were exposed. We were three siblings dealing with the same trauma in fundamentally different ways, and those differences were creating new wounds on top of the ones Linda had already inflicted. 6 months after Linda's sentencing to 3 years in federal prison, I finally returned to therapy with Dr. Kim via video sessions that connected me to the Desert Hope facility in Arizona. The transition back to civilian life had been complicated enough without adding family trauma and media attention to the mix, and I found myself struggling with anger and grief that my military rehabilitation hadn't prepared me for. Tell me about your current emotional state, Dr. Kim said during our first reunion session. How are you processing everything that's happened since you left our program? I'd been keeping a journal since Linda's arrest, partly as a therapeutic tool, and partly because I wanted to document my own healing process alongside my family's destruction. Reading back through those entries, I could trace my emotional journey, from initial rage through various stages of grief, confusion, and eventual acceptance. I think I'm grieving the mother I thought I had, I told Dr. Kim. For my whole life, I knew Linda was manipulative and self-centered, but I assumed there was some genuine love underneath all the drama. Finding out that she was willing to fake my death for money and attention has forced me to re-examine every interaction we ever had. That's a profound loss, Dr. Kim acknowledged. Losing a parent to death is traumatic, but discovering that the relationship you thought you had was largely fictional can be even more disorienting. We spent several sessions working through what Dr. Kim called ambiguous grief, mourning the loss of a relationship that might never have been real in the first place. Unlike grieving someone who dies, I was mourning someone who was still alive, but had revealed herself to be fundamentally different from who I'd believed her to be. The hardest part is wondering what was real. I wrote in my journal after one particularly difficult therapy session. Did Linda ever actually love me? Or was I always just a character in her ongoing drama? Were any of her maternal behaviors genuine, or was everything calculated to serve her own emotional needs? Dr. Kim helped me understand that these questions might never have satisfactory answers, and that healing would require accepting that ambiguity rather than demanding clarity that might not exist. Your mother is a complex person with serious psychological issues, she explained. It's possible that she experienced genuine love for you while simultaneously treating you as a prop in her victim narrative. Human psychology isn't always consistent or logical. But the work that proved most valuable was learning to separate my healing from my family's reactions to Linda's crimes. Maya's continued anger and Carlos's persistent loyalty were their own responses to trauma, and I couldn't make my peace with Linda conditional on how my siblings chose to handle theirs. You can forgive your mother without requiring Maya to forgive her, Dr. Kim explained. And you can maintain boundaries with your mother without requiring Carlos to do the same. Everyone gets to process this betrayal in their own way and timeline. The concept of forgiveness became central to my therapeutic work, particularly as I struggled with the difference between forgiving Linda and excusing her behavior. Dr. Kim helped me understand that forgiveness wasn't about minimizing the harm she'd caused or pretending that her actions were acceptable. It was about releasing my own anger so that it wouldn't continue to poison my life. Forgiveness is primarily for your benefit, not hers, Dr. Kim said. Carrying rage and resentment requires enormous emotional energy that could be better used for building the life you want to live. I started writing letters to Linda that I never intended to send, pages and pages of everything I wanted to say to her about how her actions had affected me, my siblings, and the community that had trusted her. Some of these letters were furious, others were sad, and a few were attempts to understand her psychological motivations without excusing her choices. One letter, written about 8 months after her imprisonment, captured a moment of clarity that surprised me. I think I understand now why you did what you did. You've spent your entire adult life feeling invisible and unimportant, and my supposed death gave you the kind of attention and respect you'd always craved. For 8 months, you were the center of everyone's concern and admiration. People sought you out, valued your opinions, treated you like someone worth knowing. It must have been intoxicating after years of feeling overlooked and dismissed. But understanding your motivations doesn't excuse the harm you caused. Maya still struggles with trust issues. Carlos still makes excuses for people who treat him poorly because he learned from you that love means accepting abuse. I still question whether any of my childhood memories of maternal affection were genuine. You didn't just steal money from generous people, you stole our ability to trust our own perceptions of reality. Writing these letters helped me process my emotions without requiring any response or acknowledgement from Linda. I could express everything I needed to say without giving her another opportunity to manipulate or minimize my feelings. Dr. Kim also helped me develop strategies for handling the ongoing family conflict between Maya and Carlos, rather than trying to mediate between them or convince them to adopt my own approach to Linda. I learned to support each of them individually while maintaining my own boundaries. Maya needs validation that her anger is justified and healthy, Dr. Kim explained. Carlos needs reassurance that his desire for family connection doesn't make him weak or naive. You can provide both of those things without taking sides in their conflict with each other. This approach proved effective in gradually rebuilding my relationships with both siblings. Maya and I developed a close bond based on honest conversations about Linda's psychological patterns and their lasting effects on our family. Carlos and I found common ground in our shared concern for Maya's well-being and our mutual desire to build healthier relationships than the ones we'd grown up with. Journaling also helped me identify positive changes that had emerged from the trauma of Linda's betrayal. For the first time in my life, I was free from the exhausting responsibility of managing her emotions or providing material for her victim narratives. I could make decisions based purely on what was best for my own life and relationships, without considering how those decisions might affect Linda's need for attention or sympathy. I realize today that I haven't felt guilty about anything in weeks. I wrote in my journal about 10 months after Linda's sentencing. I used to carry constant low-level guilt about not calling enough, not visiting enough, not being the son she wanted me to be. That guilt is completely gone now, and I feel lighter than I have since childhood. Dr. Kim helped me understand that this emotional freedom was one of the unexpected benefits of Linda's crimes being exposed. Sometimes it takes a dramatic betrayal to reveal patterns that have been destructive for years, she said. Your mother's extreme behavior has forced everyone to examine family dynamics that might have continued indefinitely if they'd remained subtler. The therapeutic work also helped me develop a clearer vision for my future. The Desert Hope program had prepared me for civilian life, but Linda's betrayal had shown me something important about my own values and priorities. I wanted to use my experience to help other people navigate trauma and family dysfunction in healthier ways than I'd learned growing up. I'm thinking about going back to school, I told Dr. Kim during one of our later sessions. Maybe studying social work or psychology. I want to work with military families, help people understand the difference between healthy support and toxic enablement. That sounds like a meaningful way to transform your trauma into purpose, she replied. Using your experience to help others heal can be one of the most powerful forms of recovery. By the end of our extended therapy work, I had developed a clear framework for moving forward. I would maintain minimal contact with Linda while she served her prison sentence, primarily to stay informed about her situation for Maya and Carlos's sake. I would support my siblings in whatever approaches to healing worked best for them, without requiring them to adopt my own perspective. And I would focus on building a life based on my own values and goals, rather than reacting to Linda's ongoing need for attention and drama. Most importantly, I had learned to separate my identity from my role in Linda's psychological patterns. I was no longer Danny Costa, the eldest son responsible for managing his mother's emotions and providing material for her victim narratives. I was simply Danny Costa, a veteran working to build meaningful relationships and contribute something positive to the world. 1 year after Linda's sentencing, the local newspaper ran a follow-up story about the aftermath of her fraud case. The headline read, "Local Veteran's Death Hoax." 1 year later, and the article examined how the community had responded to learning that one of their most sympathetic figures had been systematically deceiving them for months. The reporter, Sarah Mitchell, had covered the original story and wanted to explore the lasting effects of Linda's crimes on both the immediate victims who lost money and the broader community that had invested emotional energy in supporting what they believed was a grieving, Gold Star mother. The Costa case has changed how our community responds to requests for help, Pastor Williams told the reporter. People are more cautious now, more likely to ask for verification before donating to tragedy-related fundraisers. That's probably a good thing from a practical standpoint. But it's sad that one person's dishonesty has made everyone more suspicious of legitimate needs. The article included interviews with several people who had donated money to Linda's fraudulent fundraising campaigns. Most expressed relief that she had been prosecuted and was serving prison time, but many also described lasting effects on their willingness to help others in crisis. Mrs. Rodriguez, our former neighbor, spoke about the emotional impact of learning that her compassion had been weaponized against her. "I gave money I couldn't afford because I thought a mother was struggling to bury her son. Finding out it was all a lie made me question my judgment about people. Now when someone asks for help, I wonder if they're really in need or if they're just good at performing tragedy." The newspaper also reported on the restitution process, which had been complicated and only partially successful. Linda's prison wages, typically between $12 and $40 per month, for federal inmates were being garnished to pay back victims. But, at that rate, full restitution would take decades, even if she worked consistently throughout her incarceration. A victim restitution fund had been established to help compensate people who had donated money, but it could only provide partial refunds. The article noted that many donors had declined restitution, preferring to treat their losses as expensive. Lessons in the importance of verifying charitable causes before contributing. The community's response to my family had been more complex than I'd anticipated. While most people expressed sympathy for Maya, Carlos, and me as victims of Linda's manipulation, some seemed to blame us for not detecting her deception earlier. A few people suggested that we should have been monitoring her social media activities more closely or questioning her claims about military notification procedures. "There's this assumption that family members should have known something was wrong," Uncle Frank told the reporter. But Linda had been manipulating her children their entire lives. To them, her dramatic behavior probably seemed normal because it was all they'd ever known. The article also touched on the broader implications of Linda's case for military family support networks. Veterans advocacy groups had used her story as an example of why verification procedures needed to be strengthened for any fundraising campaigns that claimed to benefit military families. The Costa case shows how easily people can exploit the genuine respect and sympathy that Americans feel for military families, said Rebecca Martinez, director of a regional veterans support organization. "We've had to implement new verification procedures for any family that requests assistance. which creates additional bureaucracy for people who are genuinely in crisis. But after seeing how elaborate this deception was, we can't afford to be naive about people's motivations. Reading the follow-up article was strange for me, because it transformed our family's private trauma into a public case study about fraud, manipulation, and community trust. People I'd never met were discussing Linda's psychological motivations and our family dynamics as if they were characters in a crime documentary, rather than real people dealing with ongoing emotional consequences. But the article also highlighted some positive developments that had emerged from the investigation. The enhanced verification procedures implemented by local charitable organizations had prevented at least 2 other suspected fraudulent fundraising campaigns in the past year. The publicity around Linda's case had also led to increased awareness about the warning signs of charity fraud, helping people make more informed decisions about their donations. Most importantly for our family, the article marked a kind of official closure to the public phase of our ordeal. The criminal case was over, the restitution process was underway, and the community had largely moved on to other concerns. We were no longer the family whose mother faked a military death in every interaction. We were just people trying to rebuild our lives after a traumatic betrayal. Maya had started seeing her own therapist, and was developing healthier ways to process her anger about Linda's manipulation. She'd also become involved in a support group for teenagers dealing with family trauma, where she could talk to people who understood the complexity of loving someone who had hurt you badly. "I'm not ready to forgive her yet," Maya told me during one of our regular brother-sister dinners. "Maybe I never will be, but I'm learning to stop letting my anger about her control how I feel about everything else in my life." Carlos had gradually become less defensive about Linda's actions as he gained perspective on her psychological patterns. He still maintained minimal contact with her through occasional letters, but he'd stopped making excuses for her crimes, or trying to convince Maya and me to show her more compassion. "I think I needed to believe that she was just a good person who made terrible mistakes," he said during a family conversation. "Because if she was actually manipulative and selfish, that meant my whole childhood was built on lies. It's taken me a while to accept that both things can be true. She did some genuinely caring things for us, and she also used us as props in her personal drama." Uncle Frank had officially become our legal guardian, and was helping both Maya and Carlos navigate the practical challenges of finishing high school while dealing with family trauma and media attention. He'd also established college funds for both of them using money from the sale of Linda's few remaining assets, ensuring that her crimes wouldn't prevent them from pursuing higher education. As for me, I'd enrolled in community college classes, and was working toward a degree in social work, with a focus on military family counseling. The experience of helping Maya and Carlos process their trauma had confirmed my interest in making that kind of support my career. The newspaper article concluded with a quote from me that I hoped would provide some closure for the community members who had been affected by Linda's deception. "My mother's crimes hurt a lot of people who were trying to do something good by supporting what they thought was a military family in crisis. I hope people won't let her betrayal make them stop helping others who genuinely need assistance. The fact that one person abused the community's generosity doesn't mean that generosity was misplaced. It just means we need better ways to verify legitimate needs." By the time the article was published, Linda had served about 18 months of her 3-year sentence. She'd been transferred to a minimum security federal facility about 4 hours away, where she was reportedly participating in job training programs and psychological counseling. According to Carlos, who occasionally spoke with her on the phone, she claimed to be taking responsibility for her actions and working to understand the psychological patterns that had led to her crimes. Whether that claimed self-reflection was genuine or just another performance would probably never be clear. But for the first time since her arrest, I found that I didn't need to know the answer to that question. Linda's sincerity or lack thereof was no longer my responsibility to monitor or manage. She would serve her sentence, hopefully learn something meaningful from the experience, and eventually return to society to face whatever consequences awaited her there. That my focus was on building a life that had nothing to do with managing her emotions or providing material for her narratives. And for the first time since childhood, that felt like a realistic and achievable goal. 2 years after walking into my own memorial service, I received an acceptance letter from the State University's Master of Social Work program. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in spring, exactly 3 years after the IED explosion in Afghanistan that had started this entire journey of destruction and reconstruction. I sat in the kitchen of the small apartment I'd rented near Uncle Frank's house, holding the acceptance letter and thinking about the circular nature of trauma and healing. The same injury that had given Linda the opportunity to fake my death had ultimately led me to discover my purpose in helping other families navigate crisis and manipulation. "You got in," Maya said, reading the letter over my shoulder as she grabbed coffee before heading to a part-time job at the local library. She'd graduated high school with honors despite everything our family had endured, and was planning to study journalism at the same university in the fall. "I got in," I confirmed, still somewhat amazed that my life had led to this moment. 3 years earlier, I'd been an injured soldier recovering from combat trauma, with no clear sense of what came next. Now I was preparing to begin graduate school with a specific mission: helping military families and survivors of psychological manipulation develop the tools they needed to build healthier relationships. Carlos wandered into the kitchen, wearing his work uniform from the auto repair shop, where he'd been employed since graduating high school. He'd chosen to enter the workforce immediately, rather than continue his education. Partly because he wanted independence, and partly because college felt overwhelming, while he was still processing family trauma. "Big day?" he asked, noticing the official university letterhead on the table. "Danny got into graduate school," Maya answered for me. "He's going to become a therapist and help fix other messed up families like ours." "Not fix," I corrected gently. "Help people develop better boundaries and communication skills so they can protect themselves from manipulation and abuse." It was a distinction I'd learned was important during my own therapy with Dr. Kim. The goal wasn't to fix dysfunctional families or change manipulative people, it was to help individuals recognize unhealthy patterns and develop the tools to respond to them more effectively. My academic work over the past 2 years had focused heavily on family systems therapy, trauma-informed care, and the specific challenges faced by military families dealing with deployment, injury, and reintegration. I'd written research papers about the intersection of PTSD and family dysfunction, the warning signs of psychological manipulation in parent-child relationships, and evidence-based interventions for adults recovering from childhood emotional abuse. But beyond the academic preparation, my personal experience had given me insights that couldn't be learned from textbooks. I understood what it felt like to discover that a parent had been using you as a prop in their personal drama. I knew the complexity of loving someone who had systematically manipulated your emotions for their own benefit. I'd experienced the long process of rebuilding your sense of reality after learning that major portions of your family narrative had been fictional. "Have you decided whether you're going to tell Mum about graduate school?" Carlos asked, pouring himself coffee and settling at the table with us. It was a question that came up periodically in our family conversations. Linda had been released from federal prison 6 months earlier and was living in a halfway house about an hour away, working as a cashier at a discount retail store and allegedly attending mandatory counseling sessions. As part of her supervised release, she'd written letters to all 3 of us, expressing regret for her actions and requesting opportunities to rebuild our relationships. Maya had returned her letters unopened. Carlos had responded with brief, polite updates about his life, but maintained clear boundaries about the level of contact he was comfortable with. I'd read her letters, but hadn't responded, still processing my own feelings about whether and how to engage with her. "I think I will tell her," I said after considering the question. "Not because I want her approval or because I think she deserves to be included in important moments of my life, but because my academic work is directly related to what happened in our family, and she should know that her actions led to something positive rather than just destruction." Maya looked skeptical. "You don't think she tried to take credit for inspiring your career choice? Turn it into another way to make herself look like a victim who suffered for a good cause?" It was a valid concern. Linda's ability to reframe even her worst behavior as somehow beneficial or sacrificial was one of her most consistent psychological patterns. She might indeed try to position herself as having unintentionally guided me toward meaningful work through her mistakes. She might try, I acknowledged. But her interpretation of my choices doesn't have to affect how I feel about them. I'm not going to graduate school to prove anything to her, or to punish her, or to make her feel guilty. I'm doing it because I want to help other people avoid or recover from the kind of manipulation our family experienced. Carlos nodded approvingly. That seems like a healthy way to handle it. Over the past year, Carlos had developed much better boundaries with Linda, while maintaining the minimal contact that felt right for him. He'd stopped making excuses for her behavior, and stopped trying to convince Maya and me to forgive her. But he'd also found a way to interact with her that didn't compromise his own emotional well-being. I think different people in the same family can have completely different relationships with the same person. He'd explained to me during one of our recent conversations. Maya needs to have no contact with mum to feel safe and healthy. You need minimal contact with clear boundaries. I need just enough contact to feel like I haven't abandoned her completely, but not enough to get sucked back into her drama. All of those approaches can be right at the same time. It was wisdom that had taken him 2 years to develop, but it represented a sophisticated understanding of family dynamics that most people never achieve. Carlos had learned to prioritize his own emotional needs, while still honoring his complex feelings about Linda: love, disappointment, anger, and pity, all coexisting without requiring resolution. Maya's approach was different, but equally valid. She'd decided that any contact with Linda would be emotionally harmful for her, at least for the foreseeable future. She'd changed her phone number, established a new social media presence under a slightly different name, and instructed Uncle Frank to act as an intermediary for any legal or practical matters that required communication with Linda. Maybe someday, I'll feel strong enough to have a conversation with her, Maya had told me. But right now, protecting myself from her manipulation is more important than maintaining a relationship that was never really healthy anyway. Both of my siblings had found romantic partners who understood and respected their family history, without trying to fix or change their responses to it. Maya was dating a journalism student who shared her interest in investigative reporting and media ethics. Carlos was in a serious relationship with a woman who worked as a veterinary technician and had her own experience with family dysfunction and recovery. It's weird how much easier it is to have healthy relationships when you're not constantly managing someone else's emotions, Maya observed during one of our monthly sibling dinners. I used to think I was bad at relationships because I was always anxious about saying or doing the wrong thing. Turns out I was just bad at relationships with manipulative people. As I prepared to start graduate school, I reflected on how dramatically my understanding of family, loyalty, and love had evolved over the past 3 years. Growing up with Linda, I'd learned that love meant accepting manipulation, that loyalty required enabling bad behavior, and that family bonds were maintained through shared participation in someone else's drama. Recovery had taught me that real love involved respecting boundaries, that genuine loyalty sometimes required refusing to enable destructive behavior, and that the healthiest family relationships were built on mutual respect rather than shared dysfunction. The acceptance letter from the university represented more than just educational opportunity, was tangible evidence that I'd successfully transformed my trauma into purpose. Instead of being defined by what Linda had done to our family, I was choosing to be defined by how I'd responded to it and what I intended to do with the insights I'd gained. That my long-term goal was to develop specialized programs for military families, dealing with trauma, manipulation, and reintegration challenges. I wanted to create resources that would help people recognize the difference between healthy support and toxic enablement, between normal family conflict and psychological abuse, between grief and manipulation designed to exploit grief. If even one family could avoid the kind of destruction Linda had caused, or recover from it more quickly and completely than we had, then the 3 years of pain and reconstruction would have served a meaningful purpose. That evening, I wrote a letter to Linda informing her about my acceptance to graduate school and explaining my career goals. It was the first communication I'd initiated with her since her release from prison, and I crafted it carefully to maintain appropriate boundaries while sharing information I thought she should know. I wanted you to know that I'll be starting a master's program in social work this fall, I wrote. My focus will be on helping military families and survivors of psychological manipulation develop healthier relationship patterns. What happened to our family taught me a lot about trauma and recovery, and I want to use those insights to help other people navigate similar challenges. This isn't about forgiveness or punishment. It's about transformation. Your actions caused serious harm to Maya, Carlos, me, and many people in our community. But they also taught me important things about boundaries, manipulation, and healing that I plan to use constructively in my professional work. I hope you're using your counseling sessions to develop genuine insight into your psychological patterns and their effects on other people. Whether you are or not, Maya, Carlos, and I are building lives based on what we learned from surviving your betrayal. We're all doing well and moving forward with clear boundaries and realistic expectations. About relationships, I mailed a letter without expecting or particularly wanting a response. It felt like a necessary communication, but not the beginning of renewed contact. Linda could do whatever she wanted with the information, take credit, feel guilty, plan new manipulations, or genuinely reflect on the consequences of her choices. Her response was no longer my responsibility to manage or predict. 3 days later, I received my course schedule for the fall semester and began planning for the next phase of my life. At 28, I was older than most of my future classmates and had life experiences that would inform my academic work in ways that traditional students couldn't access. I felt ready for the challenge and confident about my ability to succeed. Most importantly, I felt free from the obligation to manage Linda's emotions, from the fear of triggering her next crisis, from the exhausting work of trying to maintain relationships that were built on manipulation rather than genuine affection. For the first time since childhood, I was pursuing goals that had nothing to do with anyone else's psychological needs. If you've ever felt trapped in someone else's drama, questioned your own perceptions because of another person's manipulation, or wondered whether the love you received was genuine or conditional, I want you to know that escape and recovery are possible. It takes time, support, and often professional help. But you can build a life based on your own values and goals, rather than someone else's emotional demands. The people who truly love you won't require you to sacrifice your well-being for their comfort. They won't use your compassion as a weapon against you. They won't turn your life into a performance for their benefit. Real love respects boundaries. Real family supports your growth even when it doesn't serve their narrative. Real healing happens when you stop managing other people's emotions and start honoring your own. My mother told everyone I died in Afghanistan to collect GoFundMe money. But the truth is, I didn't really start living until I walked into that memorial service and finally saw her clearly for who she was. Sometimes, the most painful betrayals can become the catalyst for the most important growth, if you're willing to do the hard work of building something better from the wreckage.